Timber Talks is brought to you by WoodSolutions. Stay up to date with the latest in timber, the building material that is strong, safe and sustainable. Here is your host, Adam Jones.
Today we're taking an opportunity to meet the WoodSolutions Mid-rise Team and discuss the momentum of timber in Australia since the program's inception in 2016 and key advice for professionals looking to use timber on their next project. So the Mid-rise Advisory Service is a program that offers free professional advice on any aspect of mid-rise timber buildings. So this program was launched in 2016 in response to the changes in the National Construction Code, which allowed for the construction of mid-rise timber buildings up to 25 metres in height. So in today's episode, we meet Jerry Nayland, the lead program development manager, Paolo Levici, an engineer from Europe and a program development manager, Lawrence Ritchie, the cost and program estimator, and Stefan Gerber, an engineer and program development manager from Brisbane. So there is a real wealth of knowledge within this team in regards to mid-rise timber design and construction. So I hope you guys learn as much as I did speaking to them. And without any further ado, here is WoodSolutions Mid-rise Team. And first off, we have Jared Nayland, the lead program development manager.
Thank you. Well, my background's in architecture and planning over the last 38 years. And my involvement has been mainly with large architectural practices, commercial practices, with construction, and the construction involvement was with larger builders such as Balderston Hornibrook and John Holland, the likes. And in terms of my experience, generally I've been on both sides of the equation. I've been not only a consultant, but also a client of consultants. So my main work was with the Melbourne Airport Corporation as General Manager for property over a period of 5 or 6 years. So that involved me employing consultants and understanding a lot about what it's like to be on the other side of the coin.
Thank you, Jerry. So what are some of the goals of the Mid-rise Advisory Program?
Well, it's been running for 2 years now, and it's been based on the Woodworks program in the United States. And that's a program which was initiated to ensure that the marketplace was fully informed on developments in engineered timber, and also to make the specifiers, the consultants, the decision makers feel confident in using engineered timber as an alternative to traditional construction materials such as steel and concrete. So it's been running for 2 years. It's a 3-year program. It's got another year to run, and we're looking forward to the next 12 months.
So since your time with the program, do you think the mid-rise timber construction has developed as fast as you thought it would?
I think it's developing a little faster than we thought. It's certainly, I think, been developing more rapidly as a result of the program than the Woodworks program in the United States probably found out. But it's a challenging area to introduce into the Australian scene because it has to cover off a number of areas where people are not familiar with the material and its usage, and that takes time. But it's certainly gathering momentum, and it's a movement which is gaining strength every week.
One of the hot topics recently in timber construction is that around the supply chain. So how have you seen the supply chain develop since you started the program?
Well, if we talk about CLT, it has been mainly produced overseas until recently, when XLAM established a plant in Albury-Wodonga. And the fact that it's been from European suppliers and the States to a lesser extent, I think has been of some concern to builders and developers due to the supply chain uncertainty. I mean, ships can always sink, and firms can always go broke when they're remote. So there has been some risk, but no more risk, I would think, than overseas suppliers of things like white goods, sanitary fittings, etc. But apart from CLT, the remaining engineered timber products that we're dealing with, such as LVL and glulam, and of course traditional stud framing, is all readily available in Australia, and the supply chain is both robust and mature.
So you mentioned how there's a lot of new things for building professionals to learn, but one of the biggest challenges I'd imagine is builders going from, say, commercial concrete or traditional construction into this mid-rise timber construction. So what's the uptake been like for the builders?
Builders are a little nervous about committing to cost and build projects in engineered timber simply because they're not used to it. They do build in timber, of course, but they're not used to extending the use of that timber to 3, 5, 6 and 8 levels. The smaller builders are very happy with 2 and 3 levels, so it's a comfort level. But when it's explained to them, they realise that it's not rocket science and they're easily able to adapt to that.
There's been a lot of smaller builders moving up into this mid-rise construction, like Strong Build. So we got to speak to Adam Strong in episode 1, for example. But what about the other tier 1 companies? Have they been moving into mid-rise timber?
Certainly are. I mean, Lend-Lease has led the pack for a number of years now. But I think the tier 1s are realising that in Europe, the use of engineered timber is just growing and growing. And in Australia, a number of their big customers, such as the universities, are starting to embrace the use of engineered timber for various reasons, either social responsibility, sustainability, wellness, safety, a number of reasons. And therefore, if they're going to be on the tender lists, they've got to be able to demonstrate experience and interest in being able to deliver major projects such as student accommodation or lecture halls in engineered timber. So there certainly is a growing interest. Multiplex is embarking on a number of projects at the moment, and I know that a number of the other tier 1s and the tier 2 ones are very keen to examine projects and the risks involved and to get on board.
Yeah, that's great, Jerry. So what do you think the future of timber is in Australia?
Well, I think it's rosy because certainly the price of some of the non-renewable building materials such as concrete are going to increase markedly in the next few years with the number of infrastructure projects that are being constructed. So people will have to look to alternative building materials as they did in the United States after the recession in 2008, I think, and look to materials which are cost effective not only in their cost but also in the program, the speed of construction, and also to look at materials which are renewable. So I think there's a big movement there to break free of that mould of tilt slab and steel.
Next up, we've got Paolo Levici, who is the Program Development Manager of the Mid-rise Program. Welcome, Paolo. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your experience and your background and what you bring to the Mid-rise Advisory Program?
Yes, I started an engineering design studio in Italy, something like 20 years ago. I did run it for several years, and then as a part of discovering new horizons, I moved to Papua New Guinea for a year. I had a client already there for seismic design, so I did run his design office for 1 year and designed a CLT plant for them. Then my role, it was more as a consultant, was enough. So I moved to Australia and joined WoodSolutions.
Thank you, Paolo. So you bring in a whole wealth of knowledge from Europe into Australia. What advice do you have for engineers in Australia interested in designing with timber for mid-rise buildings?
Yes, as you know, I've been part of the change in Italy from a traditional way of using timber into developing mid-rise buildings, and this is the reason why I'm here. So I had to change mindset also in Italy already years ago, and we got to the point that we designed and delivered a 9-story, which was the one which really changed the mindset in our country. So the same thing is happening here. First of all, people need to understand that designing with timber is not difficult, but cannot be done in the mid-rise as it has been done up to date into the low-rise. Into the low-rise, you have AS 1684, which guides you through the whole process. Is based on standard details, on tabulated values for the span tables, for instance. So basically, you detail. When you move into mid-rise, you move into AS 1720, which is like moving from swimming in a pool into swimming in the ocean. So it's the same thing, but with a little different approach. So basically, the calculation routines are something similar to what you have in steel, and also the detailing similar to steel. So this brings something more familiar to people who have not been taught timber design in the university. And modeling is probably a little more complex than using span tables and using a traditional approach with concrete. But then there is a lot of tools, primarily from WoodSolutions. We have a lot of timber design guides which are available for free download from our website. And I've seen that they become the reference and the starting point from many engineers when they approach timber. They are really very useful documents. Then that's not the end point, but as a start, it's a really good set of documents.
And what are the biggest challenges of designing a mid-rise timber building compared to, say, traditional materials like a concrete building?
The material is different. So timber is very strong and stiff along the grain, but is not as strong and stiff as you would expect when you don't know it, perpendicular to the grain. So checks perpendicular to the grain, both in compression and in traction, in tension, are very important. Then shear is a significant component, which is in favor in some cases and needs to be handled carefully in other cases. So there are specific rules, which are not difficult, but needs to engage specific attention. This is also why, as a result of the 2 years of participating to design groups here in the Mid-rise program and listening to the needs of the engineers, we are developing together with 5 industry partners a specific engineering design guideline and a specific software, which will enable much easier and safer design process, and also shorter, quicker design process for this specific application. It will be released in 6 months from now, I guess.
Yep, and we're all looking forward to the release of the Mid-rise Structural Engineers Design Guide. So, Paolo, do you have any examples of successful conversions of concrete buildings into timber buildings because of the influence of the Mid-rise Advisory Program?
Oh yes, there are many. I would say to mention only the 2 which are visible already. 55 South Bank Boulevard. It's a 10-story addition on top of existing 7-story. The existing businesses are not stopping, so this really illustrates the easiness and the advantages of timber construction. So you don't need to stop. It's less invasive than other technologies, and it's lighter. So in this case, the decision making was based on the fact that with concrete they could have added 6 stories only. With timber they are adding 10 stories, making the project financially viable. And the other one, which is visible already and will be completed soon, is the 6-story student accommodation for Monash University in Frankston that Multiplex is doing. And converting Multiplex to timber was one of our remarkable results, but I would say times were ready and they were listening. They were ready to take the challenge and do it. And now they are happy. They are bidding for several other big projects, which are still into the approval loop, but they will soon be visible by the general public.
Thank you, Paolo. Next up, we've got Lawrence Ritchie, who is the cost and program estimator for the Mid-rise Advisory Program. Welcome, Lawrence. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your career background and your experience and what you bring to the Mid-rise team?
Yeah, absolutely. So I within the Mid-rise team, I provide cost and program estimating functions, but really that expands to a lot of the construction management side of things. So I look at, site logistics, so the buildability of projects, and I suppose how that all sort of goes together. That all stems from a very keen interest I've had in construction from a relatively young age, which eventually led to me starting my bachelor's degree in construction at Melbourne Uni. Went off and worked with ProBuild for a while. I was on site at a project down in South Bank, which was interesting. Obviously not a timber project, unfortunately, but it was still a construction project nonetheless. And then I've headed back to Melbourne University to finish my master's degree, which I'm almost finished with. So that's obviously led me to WoodSolutions. I realised that there was movement starting in construction. There were obviously these significant issues which we were seeing every day on site with steel and concrete construction. And the timber option or the timber solution appeared to be a very robust alternative. So that sort of led me to where I am now.
Thanks, Lawrence. And I think I share a few similar aspects of your journey. I also started with traditional construction and moved into timber with a lot of enthusiasm and excitement. So, yeah, very happy to be where we are for both of us. One of the big advantages of timber that gets talked about a lot is the cost advantages. So I'd like for you to start exactly with how timber can end up being a cheaper alternative to traditional construction, and what are some of the steps that needs to be followed to achieve this?
Yep, yeah, absolutely. So when you're looking at a timber project, if you're looking at a sort of stark comparison to, let's say, an in-situ reinforced concrete project, you typically find a lot of efficiencies in the time of installation of the timber. There's a lot of benefits which do impact on the costing, but ultimately this time benefit is the most significant one. With engineered timber, when it's produced, it is typically produced in a factory, which lends itself very well to prefabrication. So if you're looking at pre-lining of walls or you're obviously pre-cutting of voids or penetrations, whatever you may need to do, this can all occur in that off-site facility, which just means that when you do bring it into site and when you start to assemble it on site, it is literally an assembly. It's not so much construction work anymore, which is obviously the more typical concrete system of pouring something on site and then going back and doing your cuts and doing small variations. The idea with timber is that all of this work is completed before you get to site. So ultimately what we're seeing is that this results in a reduction in program, which can be anywhere in the realm of sort of 10% to 30%, depending on the level of prefabrication. On certain projects it can be much higher than that, but it just depends on the project. And of course that results in significant savings in a number of different areas. So the first one, of course, being preliminary costs for the builder. It's a significant costing item. But you also have to consider from the developer's point of view, their interest expenses, their risk exposure, obviously a number of different areas which are impacted by that reduced time frame.
So Lawrence, what advice do you have for some of the quantity surveyors moving into timber for the first time, and what are some of the most common mistakes that they make in costing timber buildings? Yeah,
absolutely. So look, in terms of advice, I think the first thing that someone should be doing if they're looking at building a timber mid-rise structure, or even higher than mid-rise, is to contact us. We obviously see a lot of different projects around Melbourne and Australia, and we see some problems, we see how they're fixed, and it just means that if we're engaged at that early stage, I should say, when I say engaged, it means we're talked to, we don't charge a fee. When we're engaged at that early stage, we can obviously help with the design optimization and avoid problems where they may pop up otherwise. From a costing point of view, for a quantity surveyor, if they're looking to cost an engineered timber building, it's really important that they consider more than just the timber when they're looking at this. So building with timber is all about the system. It's all about what the timber allows you to do and not so much the product. So there are all of those efficiencies. We've already spoken about the time one, but there's other ones which a quantity surveyor may not initially consider. Improved safety, reduced disruption to the area, obviously reduced permits to the area, a whole bunch of other sort of factors that, I suppose you could say collateral. They're not the direct saving, but they are significant, and you can save quite a lot of money in those locations.
And I'm sure there's some attributes of projects that don't really get captured in the costing procedure. What are some of the advantages of timber that doesn't get captured in the overall costing analysis?
Yeah, so look, you typically wouldn't find those items on a cost plan, but certainly things like reduced deliveries to the site. We typically see up to 80% fewer deliveries to a timber project in comparison to a concrete project, which is a very significant factor when you're looking at building in an inner city location, and obviously when you're talking about your permits. But also things like, obviously reduced mess on site. You typically get much tidier sites because everything is delivered, as a completed panel. There's very little cutting on site. There's no waste, which is a significant difference to concrete. There's all these sort of little items which they, as I said, wouldn't typically get captured in a cost plan, and a quantity surveyor may not think about them in the first place, but it's important that they do.
One of the big things I've noticed going on a timber site compared to, say, a concrete site is simply the number of trades. There's obviously a lot less. So can you talk a little bit about the trades on a timber site compared to traditional construction?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess this once again comes down to the prefabrication. With the timber, because you can prefabricate, you can essentially have your trades working in a safe, climate-controlled facility. It'll obviously have adequate lighting, perfect supervision, and all the trades that you typically have on site are completing those works in a really, safe environment. So when it does come to site, you will have an installation team, which is typically sort of 5 to 6 people, your crane driver, and a dogman or two. And that is all you'll have. So we haven't really seen any timber projects which have been assembled on site with more than sort of 10 people or so. In comparison there, when you're looking at the concrete option, especially with the in situ concrete, because that's an important distinction, when you are pouring on site, obviously you have the form worker who may have 10 people potentially on site, depending on the type of form work you're doing and the complexity of it. But then you have the concrete pumpers. They obviously supply the pumping truck. In that group, there may be 3, sometimes 4 people. You have the concrete placers, who are really the people with most labour on site. And depending on the project and depending on what you're pouring, that could be anywhere in the realm of up to sort of 10 or 15 people. So you can see already this is starting to build up to be, quite a significant labour force on a site, which of course, there's lots of implications of that, and the probably most significant of which is cost, but also safety. You have to think about it. If you have 30 people on a site, the risk of something happening to one person in that 30-person group is obviously much higher than one person in a 10-person group. So it's a significant number.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. And what do you think is the future for mid-rise timber construction in Australia?
Good question. So, look, our job is really to, I suppose, support the use of timber in mid-rise construction, which is anywhere up to sort of roughly 8 stories or an effective height of 25 metres. We're seeing, as the population continues to grow and sort of densify, obviously a lot of local councils have planning policies in place that support this densification. We're seeing a huge growth in mid-rise construction, and obviously timber is an obvious choice. So we are really kept very busy with these projects. But really interestingly, we're starting to see some much larger projects coming on board. Office towers in the realms of 10 to 15 stories. I know there's a project where we're looking at down in Docklands, which is over 20 stories. So there's a lot happening. And I think, look, in 5 or 10 years' time, I think there will be a really significant market share, which is timber. So yeah, we're just at the start, which is great.
Thank you, Lawrence. And next up, and finally on the line, we have Stefan Gerber here, who is the Program Development Manager for the Mid-rise Advisory Program for WoodSolutions. Stefan, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background and what you bring into the Mid-rise Advisory Program?
So, I'm the Mid-rise representative of the program in Queensland. And my timber journey really started 20 years ago when I did an apprenticeship in joinery in my home country of Switzerland. Then directly after that, I went on to study timber engineering. And after that, following uni, I did spend a couple of years as a research engineer in Switzerland and in Australia, before then branching out into the commercial sector, where I ended up with a major adhesive supplier to the mass timber industry, that is glulam, supplying glulam and CLT manufacturing places, with whom I spent almost 10 years, first as global technology manager and later as a sales manager for a number of European countries. And during this time, I did some further studies in management and engineering. And now as part of the Mid-rise Advisory Program, I'm very happy to offer my experience and knowledge to all building professionals in Queensland.
So as you said, you're the program manager in Queensland. What has been the uptake or interest been like from Queensland since the start of the program?
Well, there has been a lot of interest in timber construction, especially coming from designers and developers. We're assisting in a number of projects, including some residential projects, ranging between 3 and 10 plus stories, but also aged care buildings and childcare centers. A great example is also the 25 King office building by Lend-Lease, which I believe has recently been topped out at 42 meters, a 9-story tall office building, which is using timber for all structural elements. And so it is great to see that Lend-Lease are committing to use timber in all their future projects around Australia, which sort of demonstrates that they have been very successful with their current timber structures.
Absolutely. So just on that, why do you think now is the right time to be promoting timber in Australia?
Well, the program was established after FWPA was successful in changing the building code and have mid-rise timber buildings included under the deemed to satisfy compliance pathway. This means it is possible to build mid-rise buildings up to 8 levels without having to go through an alternative solution to comply. So that the Mid-rise Advisory Program is really created to leverage this new concession in the building code and to make the marketplace aware of its existence and the advantages of using timber over conventional construction. So.
Thanks, Stefan. And where do you see the biggest opportunities for timber to go into for mid-rise construction?
Well, there's plenty of timber systems that really suit mid-rise construction for residential and office type buildings. Different structural systems are used to suit different types of buildings and uses. So, for example, a residential building here in Queensland, as I understand it, has be it apartment or a aged care building, typically has many walls and therefore relatively short floor spans, which suits light timber frame and also mass panel construction. And by mass panel, I'm talking about CLT, cross-laminated timber, and LVL in particular. Then on the other hand, in office buildings, the distance between vertical supports, which are the walls and the columns, is typically longer, which therefore suits a post and beam structure better. Post and beam structures are made with glulam or LVL, forming as such the primary structure, while then secondary floor structure can be made out of mass panels as well, or hollow cassettes, or other secondary beams.
So that's the WoodSolutions Mid-rise team for the Mid-rise Advisory Program. If you would like for them to get in touch with you for your next mid-rise project, and if you have timber in mind, then they'll definitely be able to help you out with some free advice. So if you'd like, get in touch with me at jones@woodsolutions.com.au, and I'll be able to put you in touch with the most appropriate team member.